Hey guys, well, we're trucking through our devotions in the Minor Prophets, and today we find ourselves studying the prophet Joel. Again, the most important thing you can do if you just have 10 minutes to do your morning devotions is to read the Bible. So if you haven't read Joel in a while, push pause, read it, and come back. And what you'll find is the story of a culture reeling after a natural disaster. And I think the story of Joel, or the book of Joel, is very important for modern Christians because natural disasters are part of all of our lives. And in a world where we get global information, you think if all of our information was local and we weren't hearing about tsunamis and fires and whatever, and earthquakes and hurricanes in other regions, but we're just thinking about natural disasters that happened in our hometown, we might think, oh, these are something that happen occasionally, maybe once a year, maybe once a decade. There's, big ones and big disasters and small disasters over time. But man, we live in a world where we can hear the worst news from all over the planet. And so we are forced to consider, what does it look like to be a Christian in the middle of hearing news of natural disasters? So the natural disaster that happened that Joel is responding to was a plague of locusts. Like these locusts had come in, and you read the first several verses of Joel and it goes, hey, what this kind of locust did left, this kind of locust ate. And it might not be different species of locust. Joel is just kind of going, man, it was like wave after wave after wave of hey, my dad just walked in. How you doing, Dad? I'm talking about natural disasters in Joel. So wave after wave after wave of locusts that came and not only decimated the crops, but you think about the culture they were living in, man, maybe fishing is still going on. Aside from that, the cattle are suffering. The people are suffering. There's no grain, and that's the basis for all agriculture. The whole economy is crashing. So we would look and say, many commentators have said, well, God sent the locust for this reason or that reason. And I'm comfortable with that. God can certainly do what he wants to do. And Deuteronomy, in fact, had prophesied that if the people were unfaithful, God would send locusts to destroy the crops. And yet that doesn't seem to me to be the point of Joel. In fact, Joel is not a lot about how we got to this place. Joel is not answering, I don't think, the question, why do natural disasters happen? Rather, Joel is really helpful because Joel lets us know, hey, believers, when natural disasters happen, what should our response be? How do we live in light of natural tragedies that happen around us, seemingly increasingly all the time? It's less about why did these locusts come, and a lot more about what should our perspective be if there's just been a natural disaster that has been widespread. The economy's crashed. That was the situation in Joel's day, and this is what Joel has some things to say about. So here's the perspective, I think. Number one, it at least speaks to the fragility of our world. When there's natural disasters, we at least look and go, oh man, this isn't we feel invincible, but we are not. Like things could happen very quickly that would change our lives very drastically. We're one tsunami away, one earthquake away, and that either fills you with fear or it gives you a deep understanding of the fragility of human life and an understanding that we're built for more than this. It either makes you fearful of the here and now, or it sets your mind on things above and gives you hope in eternity. So the second kind of perspective, I think, is the feeling of injustice that is associated with natural disasters is unique to humanity. The cattle in Joel's day, the animals, the vegetation on earth, when there's a natural disaster, they suffer from it, they experience it, but they don't cry out, why is this happening? The redwood forest burns down and redwoods just start to grow again. There's some, fungus that takes out a bunch of oak trees, and the oak trees Some of them die, and then there's a new oak forest that springs up. And then the same thing with animals, where they experience tragedy, they go through it, they suffer, but they don't cry out why. And I think we should consider why that is. And it certainly is because we were not made just for the tragedies of our earth, but rather, Ecclesiastes says God has put eternity in the hearts of man. That we know that we are not built just for a frustrating life and then death and natural disasters we can't do anything about. No, this points us. This is a clue that we are eternal, that we're not just meant for the here and now, but rather that God has crafted our hearts for something bigger, something more solid, something better, something beyond. So how should we experience? What should we be thinking about in times of natural disaster? Well, first of all, man, life is fragile, and that points us to something. The fragility of life, like death itself, either makes life meaningless because it doesn't matter, we're all going to die soon, and it might be an earthquake that happens and who knows, or it points us to, man, there is something beyond the grave. There is something outside of this time and space. And maybe I need to be living for that. Maybe that's where confidence, that's where my sense of security comes from, is not just in this fragile world. So, thirdly, maybe what should we do is a much better question than why did this happen? Maybe instead of shaking our fist and saying, hey, God, why is this tragedy happening? The better answer, and certainly Joel's answer, is to say, man, now that this has happened, like, what's a proper response? What's the right thing to be doing? And I'll tell you, that is so important because you have not experienced your last natural disaster. If you live longer than this weekend, I bet there's going to be news of something that is really hard to get our heads around. Some natural disaster is going to happen somewhere around the world, and at some point it'll be our turn. And there'll be, we just had a season a couple of years ago of big fires. It's probably not the last time that's going to happen. People are going to get hurt. People are going to lose their homes. Economies are going to struggle. Well, we're either going to shake our fist at God and go, why? Or we're going to go, these things are God's things and I don't have any response at all. Or these natural disasters are going to be things that focus our attention to better places. We're going to consider the fragility of life and we're going to go, okay, God, what should I be doing? What's the proper response? So I think that's what the book of Joel is about. And you see, so why don't we open Joel 1 and starting in 13 and 14, it says this: the proper thing to be doing in the middle of disaster is to repent. Put on sackcloth and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Go in, pass the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God, because grain offering and drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Concentrate a fast and a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord your God and cry out to the Lord. Now, there might be some hints there that it was God that sent the locusts, but I'll tell you what the just clearest instruction is when, as a culture, we're in hard times, hey, believers, get together and pray about it. Man, if there's evil in your heart, repent of it. If you've let idolatry creep in, get rid of it. Like, die to yourself, die to sin and live to God and get together and pray about this stuff. That's an empowering thing to me, to say, not just to go, I feel at the whim of every, natural event, but to say, no, every time we see something that we look and go, man, that breaks my heart. It's a call to repent. It's a call for us to get together, to consecrate ourselves, to mourn together, to grieve together, to pray together. So turn over then to Joel 2, and we'll get another clue that this suffering should be a warning that points us to something else. Watch this. In Joel 2, Joel is going to, again, this happens in a lot of the prophets, Joel is going to kind of turn and go, hey, this tragedy is actually pointing us to a time of judgment that's going to be even more intense than this. It's almost like the Old Testament prophetic cry is, you think this is bad? Well, I hope this tragedy encourages all of us to get right with God, because if you think this is bad, wait till you see what actual judgment is like. Blow a trumpet in Zion. Sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord, Yam Yahweh, we talked about that last time, is near. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Go down to 12. Go down to verse 12. Yet even now declares the Lord, return to me with all your hearts, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning, and rend your hearts and not your garments. Oh, don't just like go through the motions of going, oh, that was terrible what happened, huh? Oh, that was bad. But actually change. Look, the day of the Lord is coming. If you think losing your crops and having a terrible year or two of economic stress is bad, man, Yam Yahweh, like when God actually takes over it's just his day of judgment, man, you're going to wish that this, I know it feels like the biggest tragedy right now, but you're going to recognize that was not the biggest tragedy. And you're going to wish that tragedy in your past was the thing that caused you to rend not just your garments, not just have a time of complaint and wailing with your friends, but really cause change in your life where you got right with God, that you might avoid God's wrath later. Every natural disaster is a chance for me and you to go, oh man, am I right with God? Not only that, is my neighbor right with God? What is my responsibility? As I don't go, God sent this tragedy because people are sinful. That's not how it works. But every tragedy is a reminder that the day of the Lord is on the calendar, that actual judgment is coming. And not necessary. It can be avoided by all of us who seek after God. That day can be a day of joy instead of punishment. And then, lastly, Joel 2 and 18. Let's look at that. It says, then the Lord, and again, this ark that we've been talking about, then the Lord became jealous for his land and had pity on his people. The Lord answered and said to his people, behold, I am sending you grain, wine, and oil, and you will be satisfied, and I will no more make you a reproach among the nations. One of the biggest ideas, one of the biggest things we need to be thinking when there's times of tragedy is that sorrow and suffering don't have the final word in the universe. That even though the people are going through this incredibly difficult economic time now, and people are hurting and people are dying and it's terrible, after the locust invasion, then God's saying, look, this is suffering. Suffering is real. Cry out, lament, do the whole thing, but know that God has the final say. Suffering doesn't have the final say. This is why we look at tragedy, we look at death, and we go, man, if death has the final say, then none of this matters. It's all meaningless. But if death doesn't have the final say, and actually God has the final say, and he desires to provide, if we would just turn to him, if we would just rend our hearts and not our garments, if we would just come and say, God, yes, I get the message. I'm built for more than this. I'm built for infinite joy, and you have infinite joy for me if I would repent of myself and follow you. Man, suffering has far from the final say, but rather there'll be a time when just will, like Paul, say these were light and temporary afflictions. Christians, in times of natural disaster, where should our eyes be? Well, man, it's a time to get together and pray. It's a time to repent of our selfishness. And it's a time to deeply, profoundly remember and spread the word that death and tragedy do not have the final say in the universe. Have a great day.